be the moderator for the session this evening. I have been working in the education sector in India for the last 5 years. I am currently working as a research consultant with Michigan State University on a project working with secondary school students in government schools here in Chennai. The pandemic has wreaked havoc in all spheres of life, and education has been no exception. At this time, it is important for us to look at some of the impact, especially on the marginalized sections of our society, some of the long-standing problems within the system, and finally, to look at a few ways of how we can talk, involve, and help. Dexter Sam, our speaker for this evening, and the author of this paper, has managed to tactfully present the problems while making the issues relevant to the larger audience, us. Dexter lives in Chennai with his wife and 3-year-old son. He is passionate about the potential of education to bring deep personal, social, national, and global change. He is presently a lead senior manager at STIR Education, an international NGO working with education systems in India, Uganda, and Indonesia. His work involves designing and implementing a program reaching out to over 50,000 Tamil Nadu government school teachers. His academic background is in chemical engineering, social work, child rights law, and educational leadership. He is a member of the New Life Fellowship Church, Chennai. I invite Dexter now to talk to us and present his paper, after which we will have a period of time to discuss and reflect together. Dexter, over to you.
Thank you, Arpit. Hi, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening.
Really good to see all of you. And I think this is, I count this like a real, privilege to be able to share like, things to do with, like something that I'm really passionate about, and that is to do with my work, and be able to share it with like this wider church family, a lot of friends. I think it's a real privilege to have this opportunity. So really thanking God for this opportunity. And yeah, I think like what I want to share, I think what I've tried to capture in the paper, and I hope you have a chance to go through the paper. I want to, like briefly present the paper. I'll not go through everything. I'll not read it out. But the idea will be to just give a quick summary and, open up a conversation. I'm sure that many of you also must be involved in education in different capacities. So I think there will be a lot of collective wisdom in the room. So it'll be good to actually get the conversation started, and let's see what we all, share and what comes out of this. I think that's something I'm really excited about. So yeah, I think in terms of like when we think about whom has education failed in the lockdown, I think we can actually go into so many things. Like I think everybody like felt the stress of this. Like whether it's a teacher, wherever you are, whether it's a parent, wherever you are, whether whatever work you were doing, you felt the stress of this. But I think like what I wanted to focus on today is this whole, the government school system, and what happened within the government school system, even as, like we were as a nation struggling with like all that was happening with the lockdown, the pandemic, a nationwide lockdown and things like that. Right. So I think I put down the impact of the pandemic in terms of 3 points. And the first one is to say that it was there was a locking out of children that happened. So one of the things that happened was, as there was a national lockdown, schools were all shut. Suddenly, education became this non-essential thing. And what happened was schools were starting to get used as places where homeless people were sort of like clustered, and we saw that whole migrant crisis, like people walking back to their villages from all our urban centers. And I think like very, very early, it was like predicted, everybody in this sector, everybody in the world, everybody in this world of education, they knew that there's going to be a major impact. It was predicted that there will be a lot of dropouts. It was predicted that many of the children who get out of school will never come back. Right. So it was not really a surprise, or it didn't really take anyone by surprise when things started unfolding later. Right. But I think, and very early in the pandemic, like you had the deputy CM of Delhi saying that 15 percentage of the children in Delhi schools are not traceable already. Right? And I think, and you can imagine, because Delhi is one of the few systems that even track that information. Right? Like there were so many other states which didn't even track that information. There was no one, even not even an idea of how many children were traceable. Right. So I think, and very soon what we started seeing was that there was this, like, just this massive hike in children being pulled into labor, children being pulled into child marriages. And I mentioned, like, in our own work, we were in like classrooms where teachers would tell us that yeah, these many percent of children are actually, it was really surprising, right? Because schools were closed, everything was locked down, but uh, somehow children were going into child labor, and there were brick factories that were working, and brick factories were taking them in. There was that kind of thing that was happening, right? And so I think, like, we already see in our system, in our country, like, our country already has 3 crore children who are out of school. And if you see the sort of trajectory of national educational policies, right, from independence, you see that, very like right in the beginning of independent India, there was this focus not on primary education. The focus was on sort of like making India with on top, on par with the best in the world. That, and you may have your own opinion on it, but very early, like say by the 60s, there was this feeling among policymakers that, okay, we need to focus on access, right? We need to focus on making sure every child comes into the system. So there was the Kotari Commission. There was talk of a common school system. We need to move towards a system where every child anywhere in the country should have the same system of education. So there was a lot of talk about access to education, and I think there was some language of that was also in the 1986. But I think what we've seen, like, over time is that, like, where we've reached is, there was this whole conversation around how schooling is not learning, right? So there's, like, we came to a place where we said, okay, actually we've been able to get 97% or 95% of children into school, but they're not actually learning anything, right? So, and then if you see even our latest education policy, it actually criticizes previous policies, saying that they emphasize too much on access, right? And we need to now emphasize on quality. And so there was this thing that, okay, it's time for us to move away from an emphasis on access, and emphasis should now be placed on, quality of the schools. And it's ironical that that came out in the middle of the same time, while actually so many of the children were actually losing access. And so suddenly what happened was, even though the union ministers were assuring that everybody has online education, like, it was just like massively, like, people were just getting cut off. Like, children were going, dropping out of school. But then even who were interested, wanted to be in school, they were not being able to connect to online education. So I think in the second section, you see that so many children are unable to connect to online education, because I think, like, online education is something, it's interesting that India took its biggest bet on technology and online education. We could have gone down multiple routes in when thinking about COVID, school recovery, but I think that was the big bet we took. And that was interesting because only 10% of India's schools have internet. And if you think of electricity and internet access and smartphone ownership, it was almost like already like a big, at least 50%, where 50% of even who were, enrolled, they just couldn't connect, right? And even if children had, were able to overcome all those barriers, there was the barriers on the side of the teachers, like how were teachers suddenly supposed to know how to teach online on WhatsApp? How did they know how to make assessments on Google Forms? And these kind of like suddenly there was a need to upskill themselves, and it was not always easy. So I think you saw, first of all, like this massive number of children just dropping off, another massive number of children just being cut off because there was an online requirement of online education. And then, like I think this is where it's interesting, right? Because like after 1.5 years almost of this happening, and uh, the first wave and the second wave and all sorts of like teachers trying to do a lot of things, even again, creatively non-complying with what was the sort of official, uh, you know, uh, the official thing was don't open schools. But even in spite of that, there was like a lot of teachers doing a lot of things. But in after all that and after almost like a year, and then suddenly now you see like this flurry of articles and everybody saying that we need to reopen schools, we need to reopen schools. And I think that's really good. But I think it's something that we need to sort of also critically examine. How come we only have thought of it now? Like, how come, like now that we are safe, we are vaccinated, and our children have like already gone through 1 year of, online education. And I was seeing the other day that there was actually a study guide brought out for the revised syllabus that was proposed by CBSE, right? So there was already like a revised syllabus. There were already guides being put out, and actually, like urban children were learning. But I think then, in this context, now what's happening is there is this national level. There's a national achievement survey that's supposed to happen in November, and there is India joining the PISA test, which is something that India wants to really show that India is on par with the rest of the world. And somehow now again there is this push that okay, this literacy target, and we need to somehow the whole education system needs to. So it's almost like what has happened is we've we've like actually created a system where we have left behind children, and then we are asking them to catch up, and we are asking them to catch up soon, right? So I think just to say that like all this really does feel like unless there is much more that needs to be done, right? It cannot be that we just demand now that schools be opened. There has to be much more that needs to be handled. Like how do we solve, like how do teachers actually ensure that all children are able to connect, right? And what about all this like technology problems? And what if there's another school lockdown? What happens then? And I think there's so much that has to be like worked out. And while it's good that we set these sort of like national targets, by 2026 we need to have these many children who are able to read at this level. I think it's also important that every child actually has one teacher that actually is able to draw them into learning, is able to help them somehow change their life trajectory, right? I think that's sort of the challenge we are in. And I think like what is I really feel like I think I was hearing this person called Annie Namala, and she's from the Center for Social Equity and Inclusion. And one of the things she said is that she said the education crisis is going to be bigger than the migrant crisis in India. And she said that actually like it's just that we don't see, we actually it's just that it's actually a bit invisible right now, but the real impact of this crisis is going to be bigger than the migrant crisis. Right. So I think I really see COVID and the school lockdowns as something that's going to be a major like a pivot, right? Like it's a complete shift in how education uh, will be perceived or how it will be handled in our nation, right? And there is no way that like 10 years from now, 15 years from now, these children and the rest of the children will be able to compete equally, right? Like or 3 4 years from now when they go into a 12th standard, or they're competing for jobs, they're competing for the same job. There's no way that these children are able to be on the same setting. And so it's like a huge, massive challenge that is thrown out to everybody in education, as to what will we do, right? And I think this is where, as Christians, right, like why should we care about education? And is education something that people in education should care about, right? So somebody is working in school, should they care about education? And is it not something that needs to, worry all of us? Because obviously there's so much else in the world as well, right? Um, and I think like when we look at the scriptures, I think like I always feel like, one of the things that comes through clearly in the Bible is God's heart for the children and God's heart for justice. And I think like God's against any system, any policy, any mindset, anything that sort of places a stumbling block in front of a child. And I think like we need to see what has happened, not as a sort of technology issue or a sort of infrastructure issue. I think we need to see this as a justice issue, right? It's actually, I think that's why Jean Race, he says, right? He says that online exclusion is a fig leaf that's trying to mask this elephant of school exclusion, because that's what it is. This is actually exclusion. It's a deliberate exclusion of a vast majority of children, right, from their own futures. So yeah, I think like in the Bible, I think we see Jesus, we see Paul. They always like walked into synagogues, which was sort of like, I think, representative maybe of the education systems of that time. And you see somebody like Daniel, how he was brought into like the education systems of Babylon, and the goal of that education system was to brainwash him, into being able to go back and oppress his own people, right? I think that was a sort of like education system that was the other side of this. So if you see the Daniel story, again there were all these people who were cut off, dropped off, and left behind, and then these people were like somehow in this elite education institution, and they were being brainwashed into then becoming leaders and oppressing the same population, right? So I think the Bible is like, I feel like the Bible shows us a clear mandate, that we cannot think of education as purely something that's the responsibility of the state or of the government, but actually the Bible places the responsibility of education on each family and on the faith community. And so like I think, like I have a 3.5-year-old son, and his education is my responsibility. I think like whatever happens in a school, like I am still responsible for his education. And like when Jesus says that you need to love your neighbor as yourself, I think part of that is to see that my neighbor also is able to provide an education to their child, isn't it? Because like shouldn't my neighbor be able to, like, if whoever my neighbor is, whether it's my watchman or the driver or whoever it is, like if he is not able to like give the same opportunity to their child to flourish, then like how am I loving my neighbor, right? And I think this is where I think this present like learning crisis is so I just want to say one thing, it's so like deceptive, right? Like, I think like if you look at children today, if you're just looking at children on the street, if you're going for a walk, if you see them, you see that they're actually like just having a good time. They're probably playing and they're just like walking around talking. I think that's what children do, right? I think, and in like without even them knowing, and sometimes without even their parents knowing, what's happening is that like a huge, a huge injustice is happening to them, you know, where like their futures are being stolen from them. Something is like getting attacked. They are actually, they've lost access to education. They've lost access to equal opportunity, and it's all happened. And sometimes like they're not even aware, and we're not even aware, and it's just another. So I think just to come to like draw this all to a close, I think like just to think a little bit around like what can we do as as Christ followers, right? As Christians, as people who care about God's mission, what can we do? I think like
Sorry.
I think just first to say that like I think this is what's happening in education today is part of what's happening broadly in our world. Like our world is moving towards this place of increasing inequality, right? The rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and I think like those Oxfam reports where every year you see like the half of the world's wealth is with 32 people first, then 16 people, then 8 people. It's kind of going, it's getting more and more concentrated, and I think that's the symptom of that is what we see in the education system, right? Where we see that I think like we see in education that something similar is happening. There's this massive inequality where like on one end we have in India the some of the I was listening to one of the schools in Noida. They're an international school, and some of the children speaking, and they talked about how the lockdown has unlocked their potential, and they talked about how they're now able to reach out to they have people teaching them from around the world and things like that. And then at the same time you have others who just are not even able to there's no school for them. So I think this sort of like massive inequality that we see, right? And I think so one of the things that I feel is that this challenge that has been placed before us is something that all of us need to respond to. Like right now around you, like if you look at like a 1 kilometer radius of you, there will be children who are actually being deprived of education. And so there is there is somebody who said, right, that you can't actually like change the world without changing the one square inch around you, right? I think so. I think like all of us have a little all of us have this sort of like responsibility of like actually looking around us, and if there are children that we can actually help in some way, invest in them somehow, be able to connect them to certain opportunities. I think that's something we need to do. And but beyond that, whether you're able to teach, all that, but just beyond that, wherever you are, whether you're a pastor, whether you're in technology, whether you're in the corporate world, I think there's things that can be done by everyone in this time, right? Because you can maybe go talk to your CSR person, you can maybe connect to NGOs, you can maybe talk to, university students who can then maybe go into this field. There's just, so much that can be done. I think there's a responsibility on each of us to respond, right, in this current crisis. So uh, whatever you're doing right now, honestly, the work in education today is so complex. There is so many pieces to it that I really can't think of anyone who cannot get their hands on deck, right? I don't think there's any I don't think uh, we can say that I've actually not studied education, or I'm not a social worker, so I can't do anything. I don't think that can be said, because actually there is so much. The work is so complex. There is so much to be done, that I think there is a possibility for all of us to actually engage, right? uh, the third thing that I wanted to say is that there is also this need for us to really start tapping into the power of the collective. Right? I think like as a church, we've always had people who've been, who are kind, who are, who will take in someone, a child, and like, really like bless them, tutor them. We've always had people like that. I'm sure many of you have done that as well, right? And I think like it's important for us to little bit go beyond as well, and actually start tapping into this sort of collective strength, right? Like if there's and I actually start to invest in each other's work in some sense, right? Like so if there's a teacher who is really good in something, in math or in chemistry, and I think like if we can actually like tap into that to work with others who are who maybe have the desire, who are able to connect children, but who maybe don't have the skills for actually teaching, right? So I think there's a need for has to start. I think that's what we are, right? As a church, we're a family and we're a network around the country. Like there's so much around the country, and I think like imagine what it would be like if we can actually be part of a movement that rebuilds this nation, right? Like one child at a time, one village at a time, one classroom at a time, little by little, right? I think in the paper I quote this, quote from this the one of the ex-presidents of World Vision, where he talks. I found that chapter really fascinating, where he talks about. Titled the chapter "2% of the 2%," and he talked about how the church in America, only 2% of the church actually tithes, right? And then he talked about how only 2% of the tithes go into mission. And then he talks about what would happen if actually all the Christians in America tithe, and what could happen with that money. And then he starts sort of like just putting some numbers together, and he says actually if just that money could actually put an end to world hunger, it could put a it could give literacy, it could, and he just goes on and on and on. And I think like if we the American church is rich, but forget that. Like I think if as the Indian church, like if we can actually put our resources together, I think if we can put our energy, our talent, our strength, our wisdom, knowledge, everything, if we can put that together, like what could happen, right? I think it's time for us to start to tap into this collective and see how we can actually contribute in rebuilding, children, rebuilding our nation in this time. And I think, like, finally, one of the things that I want to end with is to say that, I think it's also time for us as Christians that we, you know, I've called it, and I've called it like a minority mindset, right? Like I think like where we sort of do our work, but we want to do our work in a way that doesn't catch too much attention. We want to stay somewhere in the corner, do a little bit of work, and we want to make sure nobody notices, because you don't know what trouble we might get into, right? I think that kind of mindset, and I think like we need to actually uh, start to become people, who when we start catching God's heart for education, that we don't just become people who, educate a few children nearby. And I think that's very important, right? It's very important, but even beyond that, I think we need to start becoming people who start, partnering with governments. We need to start partnering with what's happening, the sort of really messy world of like education reform. It's a very very complex world, but I think like we need to start entering that place, as Christian organizations, as people in education. I think we need to start entering that. What do I mean by this? If you're a teacher, if you're a school leader, don't just I mean, like, make your classroom really beautiful, and make your school really beautiful. But just, like, expand your vision beyond your classroom and your school, and start to think of, what is it that I've learned in my school that can actually help the entire education ecosystem. Is there something I can offer? Right? Is there something that my classroom can offer, my students can offer? And if you're a principal, is there something my teachers can offer beyond my school? Right? I think that's what I mean, right? Like, so, and if you have an NGO, and if you have an education intervention, right? If you're blessing that community of people, like 500 people, I think that's beautiful. But think of it beyond that. Like, what have you learned from that, which you can then pass on to a wider place? How can you actually, like, I think that kind of thing, I think, is really needed. I found that, like, especially around when all this happened around lockdown, there was just such a lack of clarity everywhere, right? Nobody knew what to do, right? Nobody knew what to do. Nobody knew how to, like, kickstart education, and there was such a need for everybody to share whatever they were learning. There was such a need for everybody to just come and say, this is what we are trying out, and this is what is working, this is what is not working. And there was such a need for that, and I think it was happening in circles. I think it's important also for us to sort of get into those kind of uh, conversations, right? I think those are the kind of things maybe we could get involved in. And my hope and prayer is that, like this would not just be an isolated conversation, that today's conversation leads to a lot more conversations, and I think that we actually there are things that start getting birthed out of these conversations. And this actually leads to a rebuilding of education, and actually the church and Christ followers taking a lead in that. Right, so I will end there. And I've covered a lot of material, but I think it would be nice to spend some time maybe discussing. I'm sure like a lot of you are also involved in education, so it would be nice to also hear your opinions, your comments. Right, so I'll give it back to Arthur.
Thank you, Dexter. Speaking with Dexter earlier today, I remarked to him how balanced I thought his paper was. And listening to him now, I feel that again. The facts, the data, the problems, and the invitation were well presented with just the right balance. I will now begin this time of discussion with a personal reflection and a question. So this is from my time as a teacher. I just have a minute to talk about a day in the life of a teacher. They arrive in school between 8 and 9 in the morning. After the morning assembly, teachers head off to their respective classes. While teaching a lesson, the higher-ups in the hierarchy have asked for income certificates from students. The teacher drops her lesson and attends to this. She is back to her lesson when a parent comes to meet her, and she is forced to attend to this parent who has refused or was unable to show up for any of the PTA meetings. This might be her only chance to meet them. The teachers have to share a toilet that is common to the students, and there is no staff room for them to relax in. The school barely has any trees or even a ground. During lunch, the teacher has to ensure that all her students stay safe and finish their lunch, and then she eats lunch by herself in the classroom. The high pupil-teacher ratio of 1:50 is taxing, and so are the extra academic work, such as election duties and other government surveys for which the teachers are the frontline workers. Now, this is not the case for all the teachers in all the schools. This is an example from a school where I work. I'm talking about this in connection to a statement from Dexter's paper. Yet again, blame is assigned on the incompetency and lack of commitment of government school teachers, but it is hard to overstate the odds they were up against. Now, my question here is to Dexter and to Brother Cherian Thomas, who I see in the audience. I ask for his inputs here, knowing how World Vision often partners with governments on various programs. There is now considerable effort and thought, along with private NGO partners, that the government puts into designing the curriculum and addressing various problems in the system. Often, this does not translate to the ground levels as envisioned. What are some reasons for this? Dexter, Brother Cherian Thomas, please feel free to step in and respond to that.
Dexter, you can start.
Okay. I think I'll start with a few thoughts. I think just a few things to say there. I think if I so as to think about why does what we say in policy not work on the ground, right? Like if you say that, I think like one of the things is to to start to look at even what the policy says, right? I think like sometimes what this is Professor Anil Sadgopal, he writes this article in Frontline on the national education policy, and he says that the way to read any education policy is to actually read in between the lines and to see what it doesn't say. Right, and if you actually understand what the policy doesn't say, then you start to understand what it is actually saying. Right, so I think even like to even in the stated aims of policy, often there is so much like actually lacking, and there is just like sort of denying of the experiences of so many people, and so many people whose uh, lives seem to matter less in terms of the policy formulation itself, right? So that's number one. But then just immediately after that, to follow up, like I think one of the ways you always see uh, how much a how much a policy is really committed to something is to see the budgets that are placed, right? So I think if you like you look at like the budgets that are and I think there are a lot of organizations doing this where they actually like go and like analyze budgets and analyze policy statements and say, does the budget actually tally with what the policy statement says, right? So the policy says this much needs to be done, the budget allocation is this much, then how will that work, right? So I think that whole thing, that again the problem being that often I think one of the things I quote is that in the middle of this, the budget for digital education was actually cut in the last couple of years, right? So I think like actually like real allocation of funds, real allocation of money, I think that's also a huge problem. I think the last thing I would say is also that I think India is a really complex country, and I think honestly, I don't think centralized solutions really work. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons that programs fail, because when you just have a centralized system where this needs to be implemented, it's very easy to sort of have a checklist and tick off all the things that needs to be done, right? So box ticking accountability is very easy, and all the states can do that. But to actually ensure that like the heart of that it goes into every district, every state, that requires much more than a sort of like centralized decision making, which is then sort of like disseminated, right? It requires a lot more of like code designing of solutions. It requires a lot more of consultations. It requires a lot more of building a buy-in, right? There's a buy-in that needs to be built at a state level, at a district level, at a local governance level, and I think it's a much more complex task, and sometimes I think the way we've thought of it is that as long as a solution has come, then it will get implemented everywhere, I think, and that's just not the case, because India is such a complex country.
Let's start with one element that Dexter talked about, which is policy and sometimes a legislative framework following the policy. In some sense, the Right to Education Act gives a certain legislative framework for what education can mean, and particularly for the what we call the primary children, school children. For the first time, we've at least tried to see a legislative framework under the UPA government, which talks about getting children into school. So that was very positive. So policy at one level is always a statement of intent, and it's the easiest thing to do. I mean, I know it's not easy; it's difficult to do, but because getting people to agree on policy often is difficult. But getting a policy out is actually the easiest thing to do. The challenge is always not necessarily a policy, and even sometimes what is in between the lines, even what is in the lines, even what is very obvious in terms of being able to translate it into action on the ground is where the failures often are. And our problem is not so much, and this is not only India's problem, it's a problem of many other developing nations where there are good laws, there are good policies, but the challenge is always in how does one implement and how does one execute policy. Now, one big element here is funding. Now, it's very nice to say that schools must have a certain degree of infrastructure. Schools should have a certain teacher to pupil ratio. Schools should have different kinds of facilities, But the harsh reality is that if one were to look at budgets and spread them across schools, the actual funds that are available to a headmaster or the principal of a school in terms of discretionary spending is very, very small. It's very little. And that is why they struggle to even be able to paint schools, which is why sometimes NGO partners have to help with painting of schools, to construct a toilet, to have a toilet separately for girl children. So so basically much of the infrastructure, library, books, playgrounds, playing facilities, it's the harsh reality is that we still don't have, we are not putting in that kind of money, which is we are putting in only half the kind of investment in education infrastructure that we should be actually putting in. We could be putting in twice or three times that, and we would continue to be challenged. So I think the challenge here is, how does one make best use of what is available? So I think this will continue for a while. The other issue will always be teachers. Forget about teachers being trained, teachers being just simply available, positions being filled up in schools. All these are real challenges. I mean, it's not as much of a challenge in some of the largest cities. They are bigger challenges as we go out into rural areas. There is the whole caste system, which makes things again more complex. Teachers are often from an upper caste, and the ability to seek accountability from teachers by the community who might be largely from a lower caste or in a tribal area is often difficult. So there are good parts of policy which talk about school management committees, for instance, which gets the community involved in the whole process of education. So education is not something that is just passed on to the teacher and school, but the community, parents, families get involved in it. Now, this is easier said than done. Communities have to be empowered. They have to feel empowered to do it. So to my mind, all this are elements which have to now be executed simultaneously for us to see change. The fact is that we are not going to see these changes happen overnight. They are going to take time. There is therefore a clear role for non-state actors, the NGO sector and others, to be able to continue to play that role. So while they may give inputs in curriculum development, sometimes what happens is that the ability to translate a lot of the curriculum intentions to local language can be a bit of a problem. So having translations in the languages that the children speak. So a lot of these things have to then happen simultaneously. Again, the whole education sector is it's not centralized. It's ultimately left to it's ultimately a purview of the state government. These are concurrent subjects. So these are for state governments too. So where there is relatively good leadership in a state in terms of political leadership and a more forward-looking administration and bureaucracy, you'll find that the kind of leadership that you'll see in this sector is higher in certain states than in the others. So these are additional complexities that make it difficult, and all that it results in at the end of the day is to see more widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, even in terms of education. And the last but not the least, the big challenge is no more about getting children to school. Of course, now with the COVID pandemic, that is a problem. Earlier, the midday meal was a big draw in getting children to go to school. But it's also about learning outcomes. What are children learning? And that was the problem before COVID. The big question that the ASSER surveys, for instance, would bring out year after year. So the learning outcomes and the focus on learning outcomes, therefore, need to continue to be important. But all in all, at the end of the day, we really need to see governments make the change, because no matter what we do, the role of the non-government sector is still very small, and it's ultimately a lot more of reform within government, to find good leadership within government, to make sure that we have good teachers, good trained educators within government, because the bulk of schooling will continue to be in the hands of government schools, and for the governments to invest the kind of money that we need. These are areas we need to continue to talk about, continue to push if we want to see change happen. But like I said, there is a role for the non-government sector, and the non-government sector's best efforts could be to integrate and to continue to work with governments, so that ultimately education is more effectively delivered. And that's the role which many of us do play, including things that Dexter is doing through what he does in his organization, or World Vision does at the grassroots level. It's translating all these intentions to reality as much as we can. I'm not sure I answered your question, but the issue is so complex. It's like being an onion. You pick one issue, you get on to 5 other issues. So
I'm glad you did that. It's brought out some more questions in our chat box. The first one is from Lausanne. I will just read out the question here. I would like to ask for some practical measures or models that Christian communities in rural areas can do. For instance, I know of one village where younger students were being taught by older students, like a mass tuition, even though the older students themselves were missing out. What are some of the other things that communities can do to make up for the loss of education?
I think thanks, Razan. I I I think there's so much that can be done, in terms of just connecting community members to sort of the resources that are out there. I think that will be a key. But I think I just want to say one thing. One of the things that we've noticed in our work, right, is that when you have one teacher who really is, like just one teacher who's sort of like committed and who is, uh, you know, what do you say? Let's say like absolutely determined to make sure that their children learn. They always find a way to make it happen. And I think we found that in like really, really like tough situations as well, where like even like where there's one teacher, and if you just give them the sort of like simple tools to start to think about, like what can they tap into, what can they do in this time. I think they always, find a solution that works in that setting. So I think I think that's the thing I would say, is to sort of really tap into like teachers and like the solutions that they themselves bring, right? Like they, because I think the needs of each community will be very different. I think the needs, like the sort of challenges that they face, also will be very different. So I think that's the direction we've always taken in our work, like to um, empower in some sense the school leaders, the principals, and the teachers themselves to come up with solutions, uh, and then actually ask them what kind of support do you need, right? That and then like connecting them with that. Like, I think that's. I think there's right now there, because of the fact that it's been quite some time, there are a lot of resources that are available. People like organizations have developed resources that teachers can use. So just printable worksheets, or like what could be a plan for getting children back into education. There are things available which we can connect them to, but I think ultimately it's about like the each teacher and solutions they come up.
Would anyone else like to respond to Lozanne's question? Any practical examples that?
Yeah, let me give you some examples from what we do in World Vision, because again, it's ultimately we're a community-based organization. World Vision uses what are called remedial education centers, which are centers set up within the communities, which help children to catch up in terms of their learning levels, and help them to over and above what they are getting in school, to be able to improve on their learning outcomes. So that's one of the interventions. It's a very expensive intervention, but it's really worth it because you are able to see changes over a relatively shorter period of time. What happened even during the pandemic was that many of the remedial education centers could continue to work using social distancing and other norms, because many of the children were very keen to get back to school and continue to learn. So even while there was a lot of disruption in terms of going to school, the remedial education centers kept functioning. Of course, from our point of view, in the longer term, we wanted to integrate the remedial education centers into mainstream it with regular education. And we started discussions in many places for that to happen. And governments were reasonably positive in many of these places. But at least during the pandemic, this actually has been helpful. The other example that we have seen is where we have children's clubs, where the older children have a way of mentoring younger children. So there is a little bit of teaching and training that the older children do for younger children. So these kinds of community models, where there is a common community center where children can come, where children can congregate, allow for this kind of learning that was said, where older children are able to contribute. The other element, and I think this is really important, is this whole digital divide. We have to really find cost-effective solutions which will bridge the digital divide between those who have and those who do not. And my own fear is that unless we do that, we will find the gap widen even further. So I think the whole idea of digital tools can be a great way in which we are able to bridge literacy gaps. So we have seen in many schools where digital classrooms have been set up. Actually, the learning levels of children have improved a lot, and the children themselves know how to operate these learning platforms. They are very nimble, they're very dexterous when it comes to handling digital tools, and even the role of a teacher gets, or physical actually being there and teaching gets a little less critical and important, simply because this is available through the digital learning system that they use, and it can be quite amazing. It can be really helpful. But the point is, these are the kind of investments that need to be made. Now, it's good to say that we should have a digital system, but like Dexter's paper pointed out, you need to have uninterrupted power supply in these places, which is why solar systems can probably be a solution. So some of these are good ways in which this can be done. Another pilot which we found quite effective was to connect schools. For instance, we've connected the Global Indian School in Singapore with two centers, one in Chennai and one in Agra, where children from these schools, children from in their 10th, 11th, and 12th from these the 12th grades, as part of because many of them they also need to do certain amount of social work. It looks good on their CVs when they apply for university. So they sign up for social commitment. So they agreed to teach children from India, from another place. So for instance, we had children who were fluent in Hindi and fluent in Tamil, being able to talk to Indian government school children from our area programs in the south and in the north, so Agra. And so this actually worked very well. And again, we saw in a short space of few months learning levels, and this was in mathematics and in the local language, either English or in Tamil. The children's own abilities and learning output increase very significantly because of this encouragement by older students. So these are ways in which communities can actually contribute. So yes, the church can contribute, the faith groups in different places, if they are able to reach out and do it. I think these are ways in which we can do, but these can never be a substitute for education. Ultimately, the whole idea is that mainstream education should be strengthened. I mean, otherwise what happens is these bypasses start becoming the main system, and that's not good for education. The aim should be to strengthen education, strengthen the existing school systems at the grassroots level, right up to, whether it's in the smallest village school. And that should really be the aim. And again, what Dexter talked about, if you have some good champions in a school, they can make a difference. I've seen how 2 or 3 committed headmasters in a few schools that I have visited make such a transformational difference in the school. So we really need, that's what I said, leadership, inspiring leadership at all levels. To probably make this, and unless these are, there is that missional element which comes into teaching, which comes into whatever we do, and that is the role for Christians, to be there, to be those examples, to challenge and to inspire. I think that's something that we really should be seeing more of in many of these places.
I just wanna comment like little bit there, just on something that Jerry just mentioned. I think this whole idea of like missional element, I think is I find really interesting, right? In like in governments, I think one of the things they talk about is like the government can be in 2 modes, right? So there is a business as usual mode, and then there's a mission mode. Like the government uses this language of a mission mode. So right now, for example, in education, government is said to be on a mission mode. So you might have heard of the Nipun Bharat, where like India has set these like very very strong targets on 2026. Where should India be in terms of education? And so like all the partners working in that, they actually say they use this language that we are in mission mode, and we are mission obsessed. And these are the kind of like languages that like people use. And I think that's really, I just find it really fascinating. And um, I think like one of the things I would say, right, like is, um, I think like while there is such a, while this while this issue is so complex and there's so many players, there's a government, there's a community, there's NGOs, there's all these things. I think one of the things to also say is that I think it's really important that I think we recapture education as mission. That it's actually like education is actually mission. That uh, when you actually educate a child, when you educate a group, a community, when you educate a state, a nation, a tribe, I think that's actually mission because you're building them up. You're giving them tools to think critically. You're actually like it's I think one of the things I would say is like the role that churches and Christians have to play is not this like small cog in this massive machinery of education. Actually, like we have a role to play because God has a mission in education, right? God has a mission in education. God wants to lift up communities. God wants to lift up children. God wants all children to have an equal opportunity. I think that's why we are called into education. I think that's I think like whether you're a teacher in one school, whether you just are teaching your own child, whether you are working with a community or a tribe, or you have the opportunity of leading an NGO and you have the opportunity of like speaking to a government partner, whatever it is, like it's I think like we need to recapture this element of education as mission, and education not as a tool to mission. Sometimes we think of like education is like the way we get people into our churches, and then then mission happens, right? I think that I feel like there is something more in God's heart around education. I think we need to capture that as well.
Thank you, Dexter. There are a few questions in the chat box. The first is from Patriti. How can parents help their children cope with education during the pandemic? How do parents help engage their children in healthy learning activities? Dexter, I'll open this to you and to the rest of the audience. Anyone who's had successful engaging of children in the last 1 year, please feel free to share your experience.
Yeah, I think I'm really not the best person for this. I remember like one time I tried to get my son to write the number 3, and I at the end of like 20 minutes, I found myself really frustrated and like more appreciative of the challenges of parents. And I don't think I will have a lot of things to say about this. So maybe others.
Not many talk about this, but I do believe that if you just get children able to read and read books, I think that's one way you're opening their worlds far more than you are able to do otherwise. And I think just getting children into a reading habit, and children were actually getting out of reading over the years, but the Harry Potter books in one sense again brought back in many ways a culture of reading. And since then there have been other genres which have also contributed a bit to increase reading. And I think the ability of children to read and encouraging children to read, and that's something that we do in most of the places where we work, is to try and equip and have libraries and student centers, can be one way in which you are just opening children's minds and helping them to learn, going beyond just what they have to learn in school. During the like I said, for many children during the pandemic, particularly the most vulnerable children, it has meant that children have actually had to forego education, and because schools were closed, even a nutritious meal which was otherwise supposed to be delivered once a day was not available. But again, we just did a survey of many, in many of our communities where we work. We did it last year just to see the impact of COVID, and therefore to help to tailor make our programs to deal with the COVID issue. And then we did it again this year to see how well some of these are doing. We really found that 2/3 of children were not able to go to a regular school continuously for the last several months. That was 2 out of 3 children. But it was only 1 in 5 children, about 20% of children, who had no educational input whatsoever. We also thought it would be much worse. And I know that there'll be a lot of catch up to do going forward. But many of the others are finding ways in which they are able to learn. So many of those children who have had the benefit of some of our programming has resulted in them finding material. Sometimes in some cases, we have been able to provide material. Other NGOs have been able to provide material. There is a fair amount of content on television, which the public system has been also putting out there. There has been a certain amount of information, say in countries like Nepal, where they use the community radio as a means of reaching out to children. So I just think that the sense of urgency now, particularly in the NGO world, is to find creative and cost-effective methods to make sure that the most vulnerable children are able to read. For our children, I mean, those of us who are represented here, who are from much more affluent and fortunate backgrounds, we anyway have been having a part of children's education. We've never left education only to the school system. We've been part of the whole conversation which leads to their education and growing up. And education is not just about academic content that they gain in school. That's one part of it. There is also they also learn to be good social beings by being in school, being with friends, being with peers, engaging with the external world. That part is lost out. And then we have to make that up by making sure that within a limited context, they continue to benefit from it. And therefore, for parents, and again, because many of us have had to been able to work from home, the ability to do that has been easy. In some sense, not so easy, because particularly women, they have to play the role of being of taking up a lot of the responsibility at home, right down to a lot of the domestic responsibilities, cooking, cleaning, taking care of children, as well as contributing to the workspaces where they are otherwise part of. In the normal course, they would have gone to office and not had to worry too much about home. They would have had a certain degree of support and help. That's not there. So there are complexities, but I just think that and there is so much of material available today, in terms of digital content, which has come up, and I think parents can very carefully use that. But I would always think that start with simple things like reading. Just encourage children to read and open that world for children. And I think reading is very, very powerful in terms of developing children and their own abilities mentally. So please get back to reading and encourage all your children to read.
Thank you. We have about 20 minutes left. So in the interest of time, we're going to move a little more quickly through the questions. We have a question from Annie Vinod, which is very similar to something that I had. So considering all these difficulties like infrastructure, language, etc., can we help the government to think about the reduced content, but quality of integrated subjects for the government schools and make the pattern of the traditional system of exam and schedule to be changed? I will add my own question here, which is very similar to this. Research has shown that the education received at the elementary levels, especially in public schooling, have not provided these sections of society access to the labor markets as hoped. With this huge break in the system caused by the pandemic, is it maybe time or an opportunity to seriously address the question of a relevant education for students and what that might look like? Next.
Yeah, thank you, Arpit. Thank you for that question and the Danny. Yeah, I think just to say that the government is the NCERT is already put out alternative academic calendar, and there's a revised curriculum that was done, which shortens the curriculum, and many states have actually also prepared what they called as bridge courses, where they've as a way for children to bridge back into education again, right? So I think there's some good work that has happened already in the government setup, and maybe there is a possibility to use some of those things like even as we do this. Um, I think like and I think yeah, the question that Arpit asked also around this has definitely been seen as a time where like a lot of people are also questioning, okay, returning to school, but then what happens in school? Shouldn't like everything change in school? And I think there's a lot of conversations around like the socio-emotional health of children and the need for counselors and mental health professionals within the school setup and these kind of um, so I think there's a lot of conversations like ongoing. There's a lot of like organizations which are already like in conversations with governments around these things. There are organizations that have already like worked on these things with certain governments, and now they're expanding into others. So I think like there is a lot of work happening in this area. I think like what I want to say is right. Like I think um, like the way that you phrase that question around like can we get the government to do this right is what I want to sort of maybe focus on, like as to like how does that actually work, right? How do we actually advocate with a government, and I think like advocating with the government is not something that will happen just by our opinions or like a thought that we have, but I think there is a process of actually building credibility, and I think there is a like a journey by which we'll actually have to build credibility with governments and senior government officials where they are actually trusting of recommendations that we give them, right? I think that makes sense, right? Like as simple as that. I think there is a need for us, like, and that's where I feel uh, what I had shared about like for us to be able to tap into this power of the collective, and if there is like work around the country and like we're working around different communities, and there is a way we can actually like capture and crystallize those learnings, and then there is some recommendation that we bring out from that. I think that starts to become a bit more credible, rather than I think that's where I think that's the direction I think we need to move in, so that like when we talk about this is what should happen in education policy, or this is what should happen in the education systems, that they're not just like dinner conversations or something we would be nice to have, but it's actually something that we are intentional about, that we would really like to see happen, which we put down and then we work towards making it happen, right? I think that's something we need to move towards. Yeah.
Laji Paul has this question. Any thoughts on how do we navigate the challenge of government schools in the North pushing the right-wing agenda of indoctrination? Especially the first generation disciples are facing this challenge as their only option of education are the government schools.
Thanks for that question. Uh, I think yeah, like this is one. Uh, yeah, I think like one of the biggest thing that can happen is to actually start getting involved with the system, right? So I think there are already you know, some like setups for that, like maybe like the parent teacher engagements, there's the school management committees, and I think there is just the possibility of like connecting with teachers and with school leaders. I think. This is just going to be there, right? Like in I think while in the course of the last 2 years of working in Tamil Nadu, I remember that there was an incident where a few Tamil Nadu government school teachers were actually dismissed for trying to convert children to Christianity. Right? I think so. There was there is always a sense in which the teacher will bring their whole self, their beliefs, their prejudices, their everything into the classroom, right? And I think uh, it is just and I think like it's not as simple as it happens in government schools and it doesn't happen in private schools. I think the challenges in government schools will be more, but I think I would just encourage to maybe like keep working with uh, like I think it's similar to like how let's say like one of us puts our children in a private school, and I think the child might face some bullying there, right? Or there might be a teacher who treats the child poorly. I think that those are things that will happen in any school, and I think what we do is we start to we work with the we might get very angry, we might go and yell at the teacher, or we might have a meeting with the principal, right? Like what we're doing is we're working with the school system, and we're slowly like trying to like adapt to the experience that we're having. So I think like in government schools as well, I think there's a need to work with that system. I think maybe there's a need to empower those like the parents as well to be able to speak up, right? Because often they might not feel the power to speak up, and they might have that opinion of like whatever the teacher says or however the teacher punishes, right? But I think to be able to empower them to start working with the system, and because it is their right to education, like that's what I would say.
Okay, we will come back to this. We have a question again from Prakash Rao. How do we bridge the huge gap between the haves and the have-nots by the middle-class Christians who have many privileges? How can the church make it its mission across the country? Can a church leader address this need?
If I can add my own question, that's very similar to that. Dexter, you just brought in the whole aspect of the collective, the power of the collective. That's the church. And otherwise the social capital that's there within the church, which I don't know now. After hearing a comment from Charan Thomas, he says that we cannot replace what the education system as such should be doing. But at the same time, want to know, have we really tapped into this great wealth of social capital that's there? Not necessarily the money matters, but the social capital, the power of the collective. And that's one important discussion that this reflection should have. If we are always expecting things from others, but what are we doing from ourselves, right? And so I think these two questions will go together. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think what I can do is maybe share some ideas. But I think this is something that definitely I think the church has a role to play, right? Like if we think about it, if 76% of the schools in India are run by Christian institutions, like if you 76% of the minority institutions are Christian. Some of the best schools in the country have been Christian. Many are still like really good schools. I think like definitely like we have a role to play in this uh, this as well, right? We definitely have a role to play in bridging these divides. So I think there's I think like different roles we can play. Like I don't. I think we can go down this, uh, way of saying that the church needs to do this, which again becomes this like, externalizing of the responsibility, right? Right? Somehow the church needs to do it, like the pastor needs to do this, that committee needs to do it. But I think like basically we even taking it from the idea of like if we are the church and if like so many of us, have been blessed with an excellent education, so many of our children are in excellent schools, so many of our people are excellent teachers, so many of us are excellent administrators, school administrators and principals, then surely there is solution, there must be loads of solutions that can come.
CB Samuel Baya would like to come in. Yeah.
My view, is that see, we don't have to supplement with the government, or because see, increasingly education is being planned by people who are not very much concerned in reality about those who are in the margins. So it's now the focus of education is very much employment centered. It's not in order to cause people to think. Now, so the church in one time it used to start technical institutions. And I think we need to have a critique of education because, in the 60s, or 60s, there was a book by Ivan Illich who said about school is dead or deschooling school. And I think we need to ask ourselves the question as to how much education is actually taking place in what we are looking at the educational institution and see whether it's possible to have an alternate way of educating. You see, even during the lockdown, somebody asked the question about how did parents cope. I realized a lot of middle class parents moved into homeschooling. They took their child off the school, some of them. They said anyway, they were doing all the work. And I was asking them, but how are you going to work out the child, fitting into the system? They have thought through. They said that they use the CBSE method or, the books and teach at home. And they said that 8th standard they will get in. And I think this whole thing of church trying to supplement the educational institution of the government, I think we have to move away to see whether there's a whole space available for us to get involved with alternate and to ensure, you see, look at our textbooks. They are basically done in such a way there is no way in which you are encouraging people to ask questions. You see, it's basically, so I think the church should take seriously the whole field of alternate education. You see, so that the poor and the marginalized are asking the question, why are we in the margins? You see, that question, as long as we don't ask the question, the government is happy, the NGOs are happy. You see, but I think the church should help people to ask the question, why are we in the margins? Why, after all the effort some of the children have put in to get nearly 560 out of 600 marks in their school, working very hard in rural India, they have to again go to a tuition and to a coaching center to get into medicine. You see, education is developed to perpetuate the exploitation. And I think we have to be very cautious that we don't become instruments of exploitation. That's what I feel when we hear, because there's a whole lot of, I was thinking of places where, there is nearly, they said, 21% dropout at secondary school level in India. That means that's it. They are going to be laborers. You see, now that's what I would say. I think the church cannot be pulled into supplementing what the government is doing. The church has to be challenged to be the alternate center of education. Maybe tuition centers, questioning the system. I don't know, Dexter, what you feel, but that's what I would say.
I think, thanks, Uncle. Thank you for it. I think there's definitely a role for homeschooling, alternate education, and I think there is definitely a need for that. Definitely a need for developing even further there. I do at the same time feel that I think we need to also work within the mainstream system itself, because I think there is a sense in which so for example, I think if we look at our own national curricular framework, or you look at our national education policy, again, it talks a lot about create critical thinking. It talks about a child growing up to ask questions. So I think these are sort of on paper, right? I think so. Totally agree. There is a part of us who need to work on actually creating a complete alternate. But I think there is a part of us who also need to work on how do we make sure that this sort of what is on paper, how we can actually make it make it a reality. How do we make sure that all children in government schools are not just being treated as a sort of labor workforce of corporates 15 years from now, right? How do we actually get classrooms to become places of critical thinking? How do we get a government school teacher to facilitate a much much deeper, much richer conversation. I think there's a space for both of them, right? Like surely like that.
Thank you, brothers Samuel and Dexter, for that. There are a lot of questions in the chat box and some interesting discussions and comments. I just want to add a follow-up for Dexter from what Professor Satish had asked earlier. The question is that children growing up in privileged Christian homes are largely unaware, unexposed, in my experience, to the plight of their peers in different parts of the country, by even those in the same geographical area. How can this change? Dexter, if you could just give one practical idea of how this can maybe change a bit.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is definitely something that's extremely important. There was this man called Marty Schmidt, in Hong Kong, who actually he did his research on something called the pedagogy of the privileged. Where because you must have heard of the pedagogy of the oppressed, and Paulo Freire, he talks about how do we educate the oppressed in a way that they can actually like overcome oppression, right? So, and this man, he's a Lutheran pastor actually, and also a teacher. He actually did this whole his doctoral research on how should we educate the privileged so that they are able to come out of the bubbles that they're in, right? So I think that's really interesting, and like a huge part of his work advocates what he calls a social conscience education, right? So he calls this entire thing social conscience education. So it's an education that develops the social conscience of the child. It is to actually expose them to the the issues around them, to actually create opportunities for children to meet other children from different circumstances, to take them into those places. And I think this is like super important. When I was working in Delhi, I think like one of the things you notice is some of the biggest international schools, they were surrounded by slums, and it was really like strange to see, right? Because there were these, like really rich children who would be taken in AC class school buses from inside their, community and right into the school. And they would have no exposure even to the, like what is right outside their, walled community or outside their school community. I think this is sort of it's like a parable, right, of how what's happening, where we've sort of created these, and in that same school which I'm referring to, I'll not take the name. You would have like these, the support staff of the school would open the doors for like class 1 or 2 children to walk. Right, when class 1 or 2 children would come, they would open the doors and just stand there as though it's a principal coming. Even for principals, that's strange, but uh, I hope you get what I'm saying. Like, if I think there is a need for this sort of. I think this is something we need to recognize, that our privilege is actually something that puts us in a need to be educated. Our privilege actually deprives us of certain experiences in life. It actually puts us in a bubble, and it is a huge cause of like the sort of alienation that people feel, the sort of many mental health issues that are there, is because like we've sort of like bubbled ourselves up, and we have cut ourselves out from everybody around us, right? So I think that it is like uh, we need to actually be educated out of our privilege, and our children need to be educated out of our privilege as well.
Thank you, Dexter. Juliana has a question. Could you share with us the fundamental measures adopted by STIR Education to encourage learning in educators? In the interest of time, if you could just give one measure that your organization does.
Sure. Um, I think I'll do more than one aspect, but I think like I mentioned, I think one of the things that the national, like there's two things that the national education policy, the latest education policy, emphasizes. One is foundational learning, and foundational learning is about literacy, numeracy, the targets, that kind of thing. and the other one is lifelong learning, as it's called. Right, lifelong learning is about, how do you prepare a child to be a lifelong learner? Right, how do you put in him the skills to, how do you put the ability to learning how to learn, right? That kind of. So I think we've sort of aligned around the second thing, saying that there's a lot of people working on reading and targets and like learning outcomes and those kind of things. And so what we've said is like, we want to work around this whole area of how do we get a child to be a lifelong learner, right? And the way that we see that happening is that like the entire education system needs to actually have a fundamental shift in the ecosystem, right? Like, so if you have a teacher who is like completely teaching out of fear, there is no way that they can actually create a child who is able to develop this love of lifelong learning, right? So what we do is we work at every level of the education system, so from the teacher to the block official to the district official to the state official, and we talk about like how do we actually create an environment where everybody becomes a lifelong learner, right? So every like a teacher becomes a lifelong learner, a block official becomes a lifelong learner, and a district official becomes a lifelong learner, and a state official becomes a lifelong learner. I think that's the sort of work we do. In COVID times, one of the things we've done is like we've actually emphasized a lot on teacher autonomy, right? So while there's been sort of like some centralized guidelines that have come out, what we've done is we've done this work of like offering teachers tools of like how do you think you can actually address, and giving them ideas of some best practices and saying how do you think you can do it, right? And then actually like watching them find solutions themselves, right? And then actually capturing those solutions and then telling the entire state that okay, this teacher in this district is doing like this, which then we've seen like a knock-on effect where everybody else like, oh wow, if she can do it, then I can do it, right? So we've been working on creating this kind of little like movement of teachers getting inspired by each other, right? Like, and the solutions they come up with. And our role is just be sort of to facilitate this entire process, right, across the system.
Okay, I will read one last question, after which we will close the meeting time officially. You're all welcome to stay back for informal discussions beyond that. So George Uman has this question: grassroots involvement and also the need to enter the policy making are equally significant. However, when there is a policy of exclusion at the level of policy making, there is a huge challenge. Moreover, there seems to be a clear agenda of pushing a certain worldview as part of the educational program of the nation. Even as we acknowledge the reality of different worldviews, how do we expose a generation to the truth, with a capital T, in the midst of contradictory worldviews? I will just read the last part again. Even as we acknowledge the reality of different worldviews, how do we expose a generation to the truth in the midst of contradictory worldviews?
Uh, I think I can start, but it'd be good to get others' opinions on this as well. I think like totally resonate with what you're saying, and I think this is something that like quite a few are also feeling. Like where I was talking to someone who actually said that there is no way that government school quality is going to improve, right? Like there is no way it's going to happen. There is no use in working in this. Let's just focus on something else. And like their organization, the person I'm talking to, their organization, what they do is they look at four groups like tribals, Muslims, nomadic people, and the scheduled, so just four groups of people, and they just work with them, and they've actually like said that there is no way we can actually fix the government school system. That's not going to happen because inequality. I think the way they put it was very interesting. Is that like as like every generation is actually just creating more and more ways of inequality, right? Like so, for example, if all children find access to a government school, then we create a Kendriya Vidyalaya, or a Jawahar, something, which like again there is this little gap that is created, and every time there's this like all Delhi government schools are coming out well, and then there's these like mod schools of excellence, these kind of so ways we find to sort of continue to keep the divide. So I think there is that sense which many people are feeling like, okay, there is actually a policy of exclusion. There is a it's right, that is the intention, so there is nothing that can be done. So I think uh, what I just would say is that there is, I mean, while I acknowledge that that is true, right, that is true, it is seen so obviously. And I think even the ways in which textbooks are being changed, the ways in which like the choice of what got cut out from the curriculum in the last year, I think there is so much that can be said in those things, right? I think but ultimately, like overall, what I would say is like also that to expose, like when we think of like in a country like India with multiple worldviews, multiple religions, like that whole like a huge nation that we are in, I think we also have to work from within the system. We have to work from, like work in those places of how do we have a conversation about like how do we come to this place where we can actually enter that conversation. So recently there was a 12-member team constituted to look at the national curricular framework, which will be released in June of next year, right? So I think, and based on the NEP, so these are like really important roles. Like how do we actually come to a place where we can actually become part of those conversations, right? How do we become, like, if not become part of those groups, but how do we become people whose opinions are treated as really important and credible by these groups, right? I think that's also something I feel is important, that our voice should not just be one of the voices of the many religious groups in our nation, but our voice should also be a credible, uh, a prophetic voice that is actually being able to imagine what education could be like for everybody. Right? So that's
With that, I would like to thank you all for having been a part of this discussion this evening and making it a rich and meaningful time. This is by no means a resolved issue, but a start to spur each of us further on. As we close, I ask Dexter to give his concluding thoughts and remarks on our discussion today, after which I ask Brother C.B. Samuel to close the session officially in prayer.
thank you so much everyone for joining in, and thank you so much for listening, participating in this discussion, questions. I think like one of my hopes and prayers is that this would not be the end of the conversation, and I hope that like I know that there is so much like collective energy, enthusiasm, so much commitment, so much wisdom, so many people who are trying out different things, and I think there is really something we can do, like in capturing God's heart for education in our nation. And I think that's the direction I think we need to go in. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Okay, let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for continuing to us to feel the burden that is on your heart, O God. And even as we look at our country with this major problem of the education system, O God, being so unequally structured, and we just pray that you will give us wisdom as your people to do what we should do, O God. I thank you for Dexter, for the paper that he has presented, and especially, God, the different possibilities that have been suggested. Pray that wherever each one of us can make a difference as individuals and families, that we would do that, O God. Father, I pray that you will bring to us some child somewhere in our neighborhood who needs our input, so that we will translate our words into action. We pray for the communities where we belong, O God. I pray that we would be able to influence others, O God, to take on a corporate responsibility to deal with this matter. We pray, O God, for the institutions, educational institutions, in which some of us are part of, O God, that we will specifically be focused and biased, O God, towards those who are in the margins. And I pray, O God, that you will give the church the capacity to be a voice on behalf of the children who have dropped out of the system, O God, and who are struggling, O God, in this context, whether they are rural or tribal or urban. God, I just pray that the church will be a voice. I mean, O God, the congregation to which we belong, O God, that we would, O God, influence them. And I pray that in this country that you will give us people in the field of education, especially Christians who are in the bureaucracy, to bring wisdom in the shaping of the policies and the action. We thank you again for this evening. We pray that you will continue to translate these knowledge points that we have received into action. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all once again. The meeting is now officially